Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to talk about the big night. Everybody's heard about nature's magnificent migrations, the Great Serengeti Migration in Africa, the annual Canada-Greece migration, the return of the swallows to Capistrano, and the monarch butterfly migration to Mexico. But there's one phenomenal migration that many don't know about, and that's the big night amphibian migration to vernal pools that occurs in springtime. I had never heard of this before I moved to New Hampshire. And then from time to time, I'd see little blurbs in the newspaper about protecting the salamanders on the road. I always wondered what those were about. Well, what happens is that in early spring, when the temperatures are above 40 degrees at night, and you get the first warm, rainy night, many salamanders and frogs will make their way from their overwintering sites to the vernal pools, and they're going to mate and lay eggs in those vernal pools. It's very interesting that the vast majority of those amphibian species return to breed in the pool in which they were actually born. And they'll often cross roads in big numbers, often on the big night, or actually a series of several smaller big nights. And some migratory sites have recorded over 1,000 dead animals on the road in just a few nights. And wildlife biologist Melissa Winter says that the impact of road mortalities, particularly for certain species like spring peepers, road frogs, blue spotted salamanders, yellow spotted salamanders, American toads, and four-toed salamanders, can really be significant. Okay, so it's a migration that they make every spring. And for some species, that trek can be up to half a mile. And the conditions have to be just right for the big night migration to occur. First of all, the ground has to have thawed out, and there is no longer a snow cover. You have to have a string of nights that are above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and it has to be wet and rainy. It's important they don't get dry during this migration. So the big night in New Hampshire would most often be in April, but climate change makes it less predictable. And once again, rather than having a single big night, it's now often a string of smaller big nights. So the big night spring amphibian migration requires those ideal conditions. And this video describes the whole phenomenon. The salamanders move silently, but the frogs make lots of noise. So that noise may be the first clue to the ongoing event.
That brings us to the big night. If you go back a little bit here, this is the spring migration right now as these ecosystems are starting to thaw out. The ground is starting to thaw, the snow is melting, the pools are no longer covered in ice. These amphibians are waking up from their frozen slumber, and they are making their way to pools to be able to spawn. And this happens when conditions are perfect. And so those conditions are a string of nights that are above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and they are also wet and rainy. So those factors, so no snowpack, ground is thawed, and there are multiple nights that are above 40 and rain. That's going to trigger the migration. And all of a sudden, all of these amphibians that have been waiting for the right moment are going to converge on these wetland areas. They're going to make their way from the upland woodlands into the vernal pools. And this migration, depending on the species and depending on the individual, can be as far as a half mile, and in some instances, even further. And again, they're gathering to lay their eggs and to mate. And for frogs, they're calling. This is a really ruckus time of year. And if you start to have the windows open in later spring, if you're in an area where this is happening, you can start to hear the different frog species calling. And perhaps next week we'll talk a little bit about the sequencing, because different frogs emerge at different times. And the frogs that are in particular the fastest out of the gates are the wood frogs. So you might hear the cackling of a wood frog out in a vernal pool, and that will tell you that pretty soon the salamanders are going to start to migrate. And so right here, we're taking a look at a spotted salamander, which is one of the species of concern in this area in Adirondack Park. Um, and there are also, so when these individuals are gathering into one place, they end up inevitably crossing roads. And these are areas where it's incredibly high rates of mortality. A lot of individuals are dying because they're getting run over by cars. And in some places, when a road crosses that migration route in between their upland forest habitat and the wetland that they're making their way to, you can have just incredible mortality in these areas. And so what's really encouraging is that we've seen a lot of seasonal road closures in salamander habitat. These are different news clippings from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and also the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, showing different road closures that are happening to be able to help these salamanders cross the road. And the reason why these animals need a really wet and rainy condition is that, again, a lot of them are breathing, at least in part, through their skin. And you need to have a really moist barrier to be able to help with that gas exchange. If they dry up, they're not able to breathe as easily. And in general, they just need to be able to have that moisture to get them there. And so that's why you're having these huge migration events very condensed into a short period of time, because the other factor is they want to travel at night. So the big time for these creatures is above 40, wet, and the right from dusk for the next couple hours is the peak activity level. And instead of just being one big night, it's often a string of big nights in the spring. So one of the big focuses for conservation groups is to actually start to create ways to help the salamanders and the frogs and the newts cross the road. One of the ways that we do this is through creating underpasses for wildlife. So we've potentially heard about overpasses created for big land migrations of various different deer and moose and bear, especially out west in Canada, has been leading the way. But another type of wildlife crossing is this underpass. And these do not have to be as large as the overpasses that we see for some of the bigger migrations. But these do have to have some type of fencing element to help congregate the animals and move them into the funnel to get them across. And it takes a lot of wildlife surveys and identification of roads where you know that there's going to be a high volume of amphibians moving from one area to another across a road. These pictures were taken in British Columbia. These were not taken by me. And then here we have some pictures of a smaller style of road crossing in Darby Creek Metro Park, which I believe is in Ohio. So there are a number of different environmental firms specializing in how do you make these economically and ensure. You'll see that there are actually slats that are allowing the rain to be able to get through to that little underpass. And that's to ensure that the climate inside this little tunnel is the same as the climate above it. Because again, these animals are relying on these very particular conditions that allow them to make that trek from their wintering grounds into the vernal pools. Now, another factor that's stacked up against these amphibians are the impacts of climate change. So right now, because we're having drier summers and we're also having longer summers, shorter winters, warmer winters in our northern forests, we're having an impact on these big night migrations. So in the past, there was a fairly predictable steady increase in temperature in the spring. And the amphibians would rely on that to be able to time the migration properly. But right now, we're starting to see more volatility in our spring warm up. Right now in Adirondack Park for the last few days, this is fairly unheard of. Here we are in early March, and we've had multiple days over 50 degrees. We've had a lot of the conditions that would trigger a big night migration. Um,
Okay, so again, crossing the road can be really dangerous. These frogs and salamanders can easily get squished by cars. Uh, so we mentioned before that the wildlife biologist Melissa Winters really talked about the impact of road mortality on certain species. Sometimes there's a big night when hundreds or thousands of salamanders and frogs are actually crossing the road. So drivers are encouraged to use caution when driving near these sites that are near vernal pools, particularly on warm, rainy nights in March or April. And some municipalities have even closed roads for a few days if they are pretty sure they know when big night is likely to occur. This is showing what some of those underground tunnels that conservationists have developed to facilitate the amphibians crossing, avoiding the road crossing. And you can see here in this top picture, here, this is designed to kind of funnel the frogs or the toads and the salamanders into this underground tunnel. But look over the top here. You can see these little holes that are in this grating that's over the tunnel. And that's basically to allow rain and moisture into the tunnels. And as you heard in that previous video, it's really important for mating purposes that particularly the salamanders remain very moist. Okay, if they dry out, it significantly impacts their ability to mate. So again, you need to know where they're going to cross if you're going to build one of these underground tunnels. And this time-lapse video shows tons of salamanders crossing under one of these tunnels in Vermont. So look there, all those little dark spots. Those are salamanders that are crossing through this underground tunnel. Pretty impressive. There are hundreds or thousands of these salamanders that are crossing in this video. So again, how can you witness the big night? Well, first of all, you need to be near a vernal pool in the springtime. And then you need to look for those conditions we said have to be just right for a big night to occur. So again, the ground has to be thawed, no snow cover, a string of nights that are above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and then a warm, rainy night. So put on your raincoat and take a flashlight. And get out for 2 hours just after sunset because that's when they're most likely to migrate. And maybe join one of those volunteer groups that's trying to protect these brave amphibians as they cross the roads. And don't forget, now it's often not a single big night, but rather a string of smaller big nights that they're doing this crossing. So where are you most likely to witness the big night at Eastman? Well, this map is showing the vernal pools here at Eastman that are off, they're in Johns Glen, right off Brook Ridge Road. And most of these amphibians are actually just likely to come out of the woods and head toward the vernal pools. But if they were going to cross roads, it most likely would be Brook Ridge Road or maybe possibly Moose Run. So those are some of the areas that you'd be looking at. So again, vernal pools are small pools that are separate from other wetlands and streams, and they hold water in winter and spring, and then they're dry most of the rest of the year. And many invertebrates that would be ordinarily be prey for fish live in the vernal pools because again, fish can't live in a vernal pool because they become dry for most of the year. So not every puddle in the woods is a vernal pool. There's actually a definition for vernal pool. They're small pools, usually from less than a tenth of an acre up to maybe as big as 2 acres. They're temporary and seasonal. You mentioned that they dry up. There's no permanent inlet or outlet to these pools. and they don't support fish. We talked about that being extremely important, and that's because fish would ordinarily eat the eggs and some of the larvae of some of these other species that are going to the vernal pools to propagate. And they're a very important breeding habitat for very specific amphibians and invertebrates. It's not just every salamander or every frog that goes there. They're very specific ones, and we're going to talk about those in detail. I like this picture. This is from Adirondack Low Peaks and Lands, and it basically shows a vernal pool and shows all the elements that we see here. So here up at the top are the egg masses that are floating, and those would be egg masses either from the wood frogs or from the salamanders. And then again, down here, you start to see the tadpoles that are starting to morph into more adult species. There's several other species that are in these vernal pools. We have these fairy shrimp, we have caddisfly larvae, dragonfly larvae, and so on. And this shows what happens as the vernal pool starts to shrink, okay, as it starts to dry up. And it's extremely important that many of these species, the growing salamanders and the growing wood frogs, really have to be able to exit the vernal pool before it completely dries out. Okay, so there's no fish, so there's no predators to eat the eggs. And the jelly-like masses can float on top or be attached to sticks and other debris. And the larvae and nymphs of many aquatic insects can also flourish there. We mentioned caddisflies and dragonflies, and mosquito larvae can also flourish in these vernal pools. So they're home for spotted salamanders, wood frogs, fairy shrimp, and other species. But the other species may visit the vernal pools, like spring peepers, American toads, some other frogs and salamanders, and ribbon snakes, and some turtles. The vernal pools also meet the definition of wetlands. We talked about them in our presentation on wetlands. And again, they are small pools that are separated from other wetlands and streams. And they hold water in the spring and the winter, but they dry up for most of the rest of the year. And importantly, that means fish cannot live in these pools. And that means that creatures that the fish might eat can live there. So amphibian legs and larvae can thrive in these vernal pools. And so frogs and salamanders will migrate to and live in these vernal pools. Tadpoles will develop in the pools and then emerge and move out and become larger parts of the larger ecological system. And turtles may move from pool to pool foraging, and many aquatic insects frequent these vernal pools. So the barred owls also like to hang out near vernal pools, and that's because they may eat the wood frogs, but they may also hunt for the small animals that prey on amphibians like garter snakes, mink, and shrews. Some amphibians are specific to vernal pools. And unlike other amphibians that might live in lakes or ponds or marshes, these amphibians only breed in the vernal pools. So here in New Hampshire, the species would be yellow spotted salamanders, blue spotted salamanders, the Jefferson salamander, the wood frog, and that tiny crustacean fairy shrimp. And all but the fairy shrimp spend the rest of their time in the surrounding woodlands. The fairy shrimp actually spend their entire life in the vernal pool, and they just become dormant when it becomes totally dry. And once again in spring, when the ground thaws and the temperature goes above 40 degrees for several consecutive nights, and the first warm rain comes, all those species I mentioned above emerge from their wintering sites and they will go to the vernal pools. And interestingly, it's almost always to the pool that they were originally hatched in. So again, the salamanders and frogs return to the vernal pools where they were born, and they're going to mate and lay eggs there. And this video shows the jelly-like egg masses.
Spotted salamander eggs differ from wood frogs because they have this thick gelatinous layer surrounding them like a jelly.
So that's what the floating masses of eggs look like. And later on, I'll show you a little more in the video about the difference between the egg masses from the wood frogs compared to the egg masses from the salamanders. So who are the big players in the big night? Well, salamanders and frogs, but not just any salamanders and frogs. The salamanders are spotted salamanders. The yellow spotted salamander, the blue spotted salamander, the Jefferson salamander, and another one that's kind of a hybrid between the blue spotted salamander and the Jefferson salamander. And the frog star is the wood frog. Spring creepers may be there frequently as well, but they're not always there. In fact, very frequently in Eastman's vernal pools, the spring peepers that used to be there have not been there quite as often. So again, the spotted salamanders is a group often known as mole salamanders, and that's because they spend almost their whole lives underground or under logs or rocks or in the leaf litter. And they're considerably larger than most other salamanders. And they all arrive at the vernal pool at about the same time. The males usually get there a little ahead of the females. And then there's a dance-like mating ritual. And the males deposit spermatophores, and the females take up the spermatophores and they fertilize the eggs. And the egg masses are often attached to branches, and the eggs may hatch within 15 days. And the larvae stay in the pond for 2 to 4 months, during which time they grow to between 3 to 8 times their hatching size. The spotted salamanders are carnivores. They feed on smaller invertebrates in the vernal pool, and they use external gills to take oxygen out of the water as they're growing. And that's while their lungs are growing internally and their legs are beginning to grow. And they emerge from the pool and go back to the woodlands after 1 to 2 months. And they spend almost their entire lives underground. They can actually live up to 20 to 30 years. Pretty phenomenal. Okay, so the egg masses, we'll show you what they look like. The top one is showing the egg masses from salamanders. They're often attached to branches here. And interestingly, algae have almost a symbiotic relationship with the egg masses. The algae grow around the mass and they produce oxygen for the embryos. And here's a video showing
Eggs
those
differ from
masses.
wood frogs because they have this thick gelatinous layer surrounding them, like a jelly layer.
Okay, here's the yellow spotted salamander. This is the biggest of the spotted salamanders. They can grow up to 4 to 10 inches long, and they have 2 rows of yellow or orange spots along their backs, and they spend most of their time underground. So the only time you're actually likely to see them is during that spring migration. Okay, we may have to put up with the commercial here to see them crossing the road.
All right, first salamander of the night right here, a nice spotted salamander. These guys really move this time of year. Got these big spots on them like that, big yellow spots. We're gonna pick this guy up in a second and help him across the road. All right, I'm gonna pick this guy up. Poor buddy's probably pretty cold. Yeah, he seems pretty cold. I'm gonna put him in the direction that he's going though. I'm gonna bring him over to the other side of the road here. But man, I love these guys. Spotted salamander number 2 of the night. I think he's aware of us now.
So there you got a good idea of what the salamanders look like crossing the roads on their way to the vernal pools. This is the blue spotted salamander. It's a little smaller than the yellow spotted salamander, but it can grow up to about 5 inches long. And this is the Jefferson salamander, which is the smallest of the three. And they're just a little bit below the blue spotted salamander in length. And there's also a hybrid between the blue spotted salamander and the Jefferson salamander. So the spotted salamanders, again, spend almost their whole lives underground or under logs or rocks or in the leaf litter. So what do they eat? They're actually carnivores, and they eat mostly insects and snails and slugs, worms and spiders. And the diet of the spotted salamander larvae changes with their size. It starts out with tiny organisms and mosquito larvae, and then it progresses to larger insects, worms, and small crustaceans. The other major player we mentioned is the wood frog. And the top shows the wood frogs in the vernal pool. And the wood frogs are actually usually the first to lead the migration. So again, even before the spotted salamanders start going, the wood frogs have already arrived at the vernal pools. And their large chirping often announces the migration. So again, if you're out there looking to see when the migration occurs and you hear the wood frogs chirping, that's probably a good indication that the migration has started. And the bottom is showing what an adult wood frog looks like. So again, top, they're in the vernal pool. They're a very noisy bunch. In the bottom, we're going to hear them calling for mates. You'll hear one calling, but if you listen in the background, you're going to hear many others. So they're a pretty noisy bunch. The male wood frogs usually are the first to arrive at the vernal pool, and they'll call loudly for the females that arrive soon thereafter. And as the female is expelling the eggs, the male releases sperm over the eggs, fertilizing them. And the egg masses are described as being tapioca-like, and they tend to float on the top of the vernal pool. And as the tadpole develops, its internal gills are reabsorbed as the lungs develop. And then the rear feet start to develop before the front feet. The tadpoles feed on plant detritus and algae in the vernal pools. The adult frogs, on the other hand, adult wood frogs eat small forest floor invertebrates, mainly insects. And when they detect prey, they lunge with their mouth open and extend their tongue onto the prey. On the other hand, wood frogs can also be predated by snakes or herons, raccoons, skunks, mink, and others. So note that it's very important that the tadpoles morph into their more adult stages before that vernal pool dries up. Otherwise, they would die. Wood frogs are small, usually 2 to 3 inches in length, and they're usually brown, tan, or rust colored, often have a dark eye mask, and their underparts tend to be a pale yellow or green. And the adult wood frogs are almost 100% faithful to returning to the breeding pond where they were first born. On the other hand, some of the juveniles will get dispersed to breed in other vernal ponds. And the adult wood frogs spend summer months in moist woodlands, forested swamps, ravines, or bogs. And during the fall, they leave their summer habitats and migrate to neighboring uplands where they're going to overwinter. And some may remain in moist areas to overwinter. But many wood frogs become totally frozen in winter. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is fairly unique to the wood frog. So is freezing a strategy for surviving the winter? Well, wood frogs and some turtles actually have their bodies freeze completely in winter, yet they're able to survive. They do this by moving water into the extracellular spaces and filling up their cells with glucose. And that prevents the cells from freezing. And the wood frog can be frozen solid for the entire winter. All its organs are in a state of suspended animation, and yet they survive. So here's a frozen wood frog. So if you come across a frozen wood frog in winter, don't touch it. If you touch it, they're very brittle and you could actually break them apart. So just leave it. It's going to thaw out in the spring, and the wood frog will actually be alive. Pretty astounding. So the wood frog egg masses are a little different than the egg masses of the salamanders. The egg masses of the wood frogs are described as being tapioca-like in consistency, and they may contain 500 to 1,500 eggs. That's considerably more than you would see with the salamander egg masses. So these egg masses grow from walnut size to as big as a softball, and they tend to float around in the vernal pools. And as we mentioned before with the salamander egg masses, algae have almost a symbiotic relationship with them. So again, these egg masses grow with the algae. And again, we're going to show the difference between the egg masses of the wood frogs and those of the salamanders. So again, the wood frog egg masses are bigger, they're tapioca-like in consistency, and they've got a lot of eggs, 500 to 1,500. On the other hand, the egg masses of the spotted salamanders are more jelly-like, and they may only contain up to 100 eggs. And once again, algae grow in both types, so almost in a symbiotic relationship.
Here you can see the difference between wood frog egg masses in my right hand and spotted salamander egg masses in my left hand. You can see there's a lot more wood frog eggs, but also you can see the thick coating of jelly around the salamander eggs as opposed to kind of the individual eggs in their own jelly mass for the wood frogs.
Okay, so the emerging wood frog tadpoles initially graze upon the algae that are surrounding the egg masses, and they have internal gills that are going to be reabsorbed as their lungs develop. And again, their back legs develop first. This one just has back legs, and then later on, their front legs will come out. Now, I also mentioned that spring peepers may be part of the migration. Spring peepers are little guys. They're only about an inch long, but they're very noisy. And they may breed in vernal pools, but they actually probably prefer permanent water at other times so they can avoid predators. And they have a vocal sac that expands and deflates like a balloon to create a short and distinct peeping sound, which we'll hear in a minute. And it's only the males that make this loud, high-pitched sound, and they use it to attract mates. So once again, the top shows this vocal sac that's expanding and will later deflate to create that short peeping sound. And let's listen to it. Pretty noisy bunch, but those of you who live here in New Hampshire and Vermont are pretty used to hearing this sound of the spring peepers in springtime. Okay, so what are the other denizens of the vernal pools? Well, fairy shrimp, caddisfly larvae, dragonfly larvae, mosquito larvae, algae, and probably a few others as well. So this showing a fairy shrimp. Well, it's mostly amphibians that need the vernal pools. The fairy shrimp is a crustacean that depends on the vernal pools. And they're filter feeders and they feed on the plankton in the pool. But their entire life is actually in the vernal pool. They just become dormant once the pool dries up. Caddisflies, the larvae of the caddisfly thrive in vernal pools. And they protect themselves by building cases around themselves. They use debris from the bottom of the pond to build these cases, which is what you see up here. And then the bottom shows what the larvae looks like after it shed that case. It almost looks like a wet caterpillar. But the caddisfly larvae do thrive in the vernal pools, and the adults are terrestrial. And in the ponds, these larvae cut and assemble small vegetation bits into these portable homes or cases that are really thin tubes, often glued together the long way. Almost looks like Lincoln log chimneys, and they're made of mini twigs and other things from the bottom. And they actually have a gland that produces silk, and they will use that silk to glue together many of these materials. And they'll use materials like twigs, leaves, sand grains, pebbles, snail shells, and either other caddisfly cases to make these cases. And the caddisflies can leave their case of sticks or stones, or a naked larva looks like a wet caterpillar. So no, this is not a shish kebab. This is actually a caddisfly larva that's encased with the case that it built. So again, it used pond matter, glued it together with this silk that it produces. I guess that's a pretty good camouflage job. It also helps keep them underwater. It's pretty heavy. So it's not just amphibians and wildlife that you're going to see in the vernal pools. There actually is usually a rich display of wildflowers around the vernal pools. And they're usually ephemerals like trout lily and bloodroot that are among the earliest flowers to bloom in the springtime. And those plants may also help return important nutrients to the soil. So again, vernal pools are an important part of the whole forest ecology. All those species that are dependent on the vernal pool, except for the fairy shrimp, eventually are exported to the woodlands. And actually, an interesting fact is that the biomass, or the weight of all the amphibians that are dependent on the vernal pool, is actually greater than the biomass of all the birds and mammals that are in our woodlands. Pretty interesting statistic. And again, all those amphibians become part of the food chain that supports all sorts of wildlife. It supports reptiles, mammals, birds, even predatory insects. Turtles will come to the vernal pools to eat some of the eggs. Raccoons, skunks, and some birds of prey may also feed on the eggs or emerging amphibians. And we mentioned before, barred owls like to hang out near vernal pools because they can prey on some of those other animals that are hanging out around the vernal pools. So again, what good are the amphibians to the ecology at the vernal pool? Well, they can help control some of the insect populations. Remember, they feed on larvae of unwanted insects like mosquitoes, and they themselves eventually become part of the food chain and are an important prey species for many wildlife species. So one of the problems is that amphibians seem to be going extinct. It's actually estimated that half of all our amphibians could go extinct in our lifetime. And there are several factors leading to that loss of amphibians. One is habitat loss from our human building things. Another is invasive species. Another is pollution. Climate change is a big one. Loss of insects that they feed on. I think you all know that the number of insects has declined dramatically over the last several decades. And they can also get some diseases. One is called chytrid fungus. And again, the road mortality that we talked about. So as they're migrating, they often get squished by cars that are on the roads. So again, we talked about the climate change. It can definitely have an impact on vernal pools. Our winters are shorter, they start later and they end earlier. But the temperatures may still fluctuate once the winter is ended. So that sometimes can cause mixed signals for the amphibians, telling them when to migrate. But climate change is also causing periods of heavy precipitation interspersed with periods of prolonged drought. And if the vernal pool evaporates too soon, the emerging amphibians may not be ready for the real world. So if you want to learn more about vernal pools and particularly about the big night migration, here are some great resources. You can get those on the PowerPoint that will accompany these on the Eastman web portal. So that's a little bit about big night. We hope that you've gotten something out of this, and go out, see if you can find